What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is all about the Ba'omar monks. Believe it or not, this creepy thing you saw crawling around Jabba's palace is actually a monk. And the story of how he goes from looking like this to this is pretty damn creepy. No one knows where exactly this faith comes from, but many historians think it dates back to around 700 BBY. They were an ascetic religion, which believed that cutting yourself off from physical sensations would allow you to better study the meaning of the universe. For some reason, followers of this way of life left the planet it was started on, and with only a few years after its creation, started showing up on Tatooine. It's said that they picked this desert planet because its harsh environment offered no comfort to the monks, and it was completely devoid of distraction, and thus ideal for sitting in meditation. They didn't have a lot of tenets or beliefs, and their only real goal was to separate the mind from the physical body. In order to better attune yourself with the cosmos, one needed to escape the flesh and not rely so heavily on your senses. Many of these monks gave up speaking, gave up all of their belongings, and wore the simplest, if any, clothing. It might sound crazy, but some things to validate their claims were the fact that many of these monks became really good healers and would offer aid to anybody who came across their sanctuaries. And perhaps their biggest achievement was the fact that they could develop telepathic skills. By spending so much time in their own head, somehow they gained the ability to talk to others' minds directly. This would be considered by other monks to be their sign of having achieved some great wisdom. To assess just how enlightened their fellow monks were becoming, they believed that there were several different stages along the path to becoming a fully realized Ba'omar monk. At each of these different stages, monks had to undergo a test to demonstrate their mastery. They had to demonstrate a strong logical reasoning ability, knowledge of all of the Ba'omar sacred texts, and to demonstrate that a monk had fully cut himself off from the physical world. The other monks would perform all kinds of different painful tasks on the monk's body, just to see if his mind was truly cut off from the flesh. If a monk could show mastery at each of these different stages, then they would begin the horrifying transformation. These Ba'omar masters were now considered to be enlightened. This ultimate asceticism meant that they had absolutely no use for their bodies. So, like any good philosopher, they took their beliefs to their logical conclusion. If there was no need for the body, then let's get rid of it. Lower ranking monks were recruited to surgically remove the enlightened monk's brain and put it into a life-sustaining, nutrient-filled jar. Being master healers, the surgery was said to be painless, as they were able to make excellent use of all kinds of different anesthetics. Once the brain was placed into this jar, they were all transferred to the Great Room of the Enlightened. Here they kept an enormous document called the Ba'omar Registry, which was a collection of both their teachings and the list of names of monks who had become enlightened. The monks' disembodied brains would sit there on the shelf, completely removed from all of those bodily distractions, and thus were able to focus all of their mental strength at trying to ponder the infinite mystery of the universe. Their fellow monks would carefully monitor all of the life support systems, and could receive telepathic instructions from the brain sitting in the jar. If for some reason one of these enlightened brains wanted to move around their monastery, they would be attached to a BT-16 spider droid. These droids were created by the Ba'omar monks themselves, but are said to be based on an old perimeter droid design, which dates back up to 4,000 years earlier. These droids were incredibly simple, and just had basic motor systems attached to a very simple computer, which could be manipulated by the monks' telepathic messages. But even though it had a simple control mechanism, there was still a pretty difficult learning curve to try and figure out how to telepathically control a spider that's holding your brain jar. And so, although most figured out how to use it eventually, many monks still preferred to stay in their jars on the shelf. But you might be wondering, how is it that these enlightened monk droids ended up in Jabba's palace? How could beings that took asceticism so seriously end up hanging out in a palace that was dedicated to all kinds of sensory pleasure? Well, that's because the infamous Jabba the Hutt just decided to take ownership of the Ba'omar's temple. See, Jabba's palace was originally built using the hulls of the large shipping vessels that brought the very first Ba'omar monks to Tatooine. But the Ba'omar weren't completely taken off guard, because their temple had been overrun by criminals for about 500 years at that point. Back then, a famous pirate named Alcara was being hunted by both the Tuskens and the new human settlers. Seeking refuge, he hid out with the Ba'omar monks, who allowed this pirate and their crew to set up operations in this temple. Perhaps they thought that by providing a good example, Alcara would give up his pirating ways, but sadly for the monks, this never happened, and instead a loose kind of agreement was formed, in which none of the thugs would ever try and go into the Great Room of the Enlightened, mess with any of the monks, or the enlightened brains in the jars, and these criminals would make sure that the Tusken Raiders would never raid their temple again. So Jabba's takeover wasn't that revolutionary, more like just being under new management. Let's go ahead and take a break here, and in part 2, we'll talk about how life at Jabba's palace changed the Ba'omar order forever, making them do some pretty dark and twisted stuff. So I'll see you guys over on part 2.